Uh, Thank you all for coming. Um, Thanks to all the folks who organized this event, created this space to bring us all here. And thanks to the land that's holding us up, feeding us. My name is Peter. It's good to see you all here. Um, not that long ago, some of the organizers of this event reached out to me and asked if I could come and talk about hope, which was very interesting to me because I've been thinking about hope a whole lot lately. Um, Namely because I don't have any. Hope for me is lately sort of like a shitty boyfriend who's like fucked you over one too many times and doesn't even pay his half of the rent. Um, but I don't want that to be the end of the story. Uh, Glutton for punishment, maybe. What is keeping me from letting hope back into my heart? That's a question that I decided to hone in on when I was thinking about they seem pretty desperate. If they're asking me a few weeks out, and I should do my best for this. So I was asking myself, what is it? What are some of the main things that are keeping me from letting hope back into my heart? Anyone who knows me knows that I can go on and on and on and on, and I'm going to do my best not to do that here. So I'm going to name three things: pragmatism, simplistic analysis, and connivance. As brief as I can, pragmatism. Pragmatism, it means, one way of looking at it, working with what you got, which can make a lot of sense. In fact, there's a whole lot of studies, about polls, that show that an option that is present, people are much more likely to choose, which becomes a huge problem when the options that are present are exactly the things that are killing us, exactly the things that are endangering our survival. Right now in this society, the institutions of power that are currently present are exactly what we need to get rid of, what we need to completely uproot and replace with things that are much healthier, with things that are not based in oppression, exploitation, mass murder, colonialism. Pragmatism. There was a 2020 poll. There was a poll in May of 2020, May or June of 2020, if folks remember some of the things that were going on then, and like a series of polls. And in those polls, people, were feeling like below 50% about Trump, slightly below 50% about Biden, above 50% about the anti-racist, anti-police movement that was burning down police stations all over the country. So actually abolishing the police, getting rid of the police by any means necessary, by any means compatible with that goal, was more popular than our existing political system. And it's no coincidence that was the case in the polling that was taken while it was happening, right? When this was an option right in front of people. Normally those things are happening, those forms of resistance are happening, but they're criminalized, they're marginalized, they're invisibilized, they're not right in front of people. So we're like, oh, this guy or that guy, this institution or that institution, that's pragmatism. And we have a sort of built-in prejudice to most of us to try to work with what's in front of us. Makes sense in a lot of circumstances. We don't happen to have the luxury of inhabiting one of those historical circumstances in this generation or the next or the last one. Not yet. I hear someone hopeful out there. All right. I like that. Rescue, please. Simplistic analysis. Trying to be brief. Things that raise red flags for me is any analysis that purports to be a critical analysis, a way of helping us understand this world and the problems that we need to overcome and survive. If this analysis kind of divides everyone into good guys and bad guys, that's a red flag. If it gives us a blueprint, it comes to us with a blueprint. Here, this will impose this on the land, or if it gets us to silo our problems, any kind of single issue approach, any kind of okay, well, this is too complicated. Let's I wish I could just dramatically. I don't want to damage these books. They're probably good books if they're here, but like I'd love. Let's get let's get rid of all this complexity and just focus on this like one little thing. It'll be more practical. It'll be more more effective to do it that way. Those are all big red flags for me, and things that I definitely don't place my hope in. Connivance. I was thinking connivance, kind of an old-fashioned word, which is, in my book, that's kind of a plus, but also kind of a weird word, a little bit of a minus. Why not just say complicity? But really, and like, I don't want to be, I don't want to like get into terms that mobilize guilt. I'm like a second or third generation recovering Calvinist. Like that shit leaves scars. Like that is no good. So I went with connivance instead of complicity because we're all complicit, involuntarily. And also, let's be honest, sometimes voluntarily. All of us sometimes, and some of us most of the time, choose the easy path because you can't survive otherwise. Like it gets exhausting. Like we can't always make the best decision, and we shouldn't expect that of ourselves, and we shouldn't feel impure when we're going with a path that presents us with less friction. And all of those nice, buttered rails, those have been laid down for us by the people who, own the foundries and took over the land and, are the ones who are empowered to set down those tracks that are very easy to follow. So when I talk about connivance, I mean the people who are getting paid big bucks to keep our movements misinformed and forgetful. I'm talking about NGO directors pulling in six figures or the tenured academics getting six figures, 100,000, 200,000, 600,000 bucks a year, own their own house and all of that to really kind of conduct our resistance in certain ways. Because there was a day when the state, when those in power were like, oh, this is the natural order. I'm king. It's because God said so. And that's just natural. And so the natural order of society is to accept that. And conflict is something that comes from outside, from bad foreign agents, coming from the outside, interrupting the natural state of society, of hierarchical, exploitative society, which is harmonious. After enough revolutions and rebellions, they wised up and they're like, okay, the natural state of this kind of society is conflictual, which means that the right wing has a role to play, killing, murdering, repressing, terrorizing, etc. But going back to the original meaning of the term right wing and left wing, which was like the right and the left of the aisle, the parliamentary or the congressional aisle, so inside the system, inside government, the left side of that has a role to play of funding us, doing leadership trainings and getting us to let's be pragmatic. Let's break this down and let's look into the most immediate issues and the available resources for this single issue. And let's leave the rest off the table, for now. We'll get back to that later, we promise. All of us I was going to say all of us have to pay rent. Not everyone is in the same boat. And, we can also, compared to other folks, count ourselves lucky to be able to have a place to rent. But, there's a need for money, which is imposed, which is non-voluntary. And I'm not talking about the possibility of a perfect job, but there's differing levels of complicity, which is why I don't want to talk about complicity. So there are folks out there who get paid a whole lot of money to direct us, to keep us on certain tracks. I was speaking recently with two different occasions, completely different people who don't even know each other. One of them, Dean Spade, who some of you might know, and another, someone who I just met. I don't have his, I haven't checked in with him, and I don't have permission to talk about our conversation, so I'll just refer to him by his first name, Domingo from Harlem. Dean Spade was invited to give sort of be on an opening panel for a really big convention about abolition in Chicago. And all the big NGOs were there, all the big names, all the big tenured academics who have made honestly shitloads of money, more money than most of us have ever seen in our lives, writing and talking about abolition. And Dean was feeling very frustrated because he's an anarchist and for him, abolition is connected to abolishing all forms of oppressive authority. completely abolishing the prisons, abolishing the state, abolishing all capitalist and white supremacist institutions, and helping create a society based on mutual aid, like what the earlier panel was talking about, based on solidarity. Um, and so, like, he gave, like, he and the others in the opening gave like a rousing talk about abolition and about mutual aid and all those things. And then he had the feeling that all of like the individual panels and workshops throughout the whole rest of the weekend were all sort of sniping at any actually radical approach. Shit talking the anarchists, saying, oh, mutual aid, that sounds nice, but and it's funny because these same, like, the big NGOs that I heard C make like a distinction between like the grassroots and the grass tops earlier, talking about like the big NGOs, like, they'll put, the phrase mutual aid, like, if it helps them get donations. But like in these, like, smaller group discussions where it's all where the sausage gets made, if you will, they're all like, talking shit on it, and like it's really about having something to sell, getting the big grants, and keeping control of the discourse. And in those small, where the sausage gets made, they were all contradicting and very much hemming in, silencing, or erasing all of the discourses and the ideas and the histories that the same conference organizers had invited to make up the whole opening. What is that called? Is it a plenary, or I don't know? Yeah, okay, the whole opening plenary. And so Dean shared this experience of we were kind of like processing this together, and it's like almost like there's nothing inspiring or real or true about the work that like these kind of like self-appointed movement leaders or butchers or whatever, they kind of recognize that they're speaking with a corpse in their mouths, right? And so they need these other examples of like inspiration. But then in the end, they can we say reconduct in English? They redirect that to a terrain that they can control. Similarly, I was at a, found myself, slash got a chance to get paid to go to, a conference that was talking about mostly environmental issues, and things like urban gardening came up. And that's where I met Domingo, who participates in a lot of urban gardening in New York City. And he got invited to give like an opening address that was very, very inspiring, very radical. And then we kind of met because we were like depressed, not having a good time, pretty critical about how like all of the rest of it was all like, how to get a grant from the government, how to like, market yourselves better, how to make more money, green capitalism, and the whole nonprofit industrial complex hand in hand. And so there's that pattern again of like using radicality to kind of inject life into something that actually has no creative force whatsoever, something that is really just managing the decomposition of a corpse, right? And that I'm probably sounding incredibly naive, like if there were folks from like and like I mentioned, like we all got to like work a job, and like there are folks like in this room who like are working in like some of these like smaller NGOs, and like I appreciate like the distinction that was made earlier, so that we're not accidentally like trading insults amongst ourselves, because like we're trying to talk about like the big, like the industry, like the big ones, like the ones that are moving hundreds of millions of dollars or more. They might come in here and like kind of like laugh about like how how naive I'm being. Like it's almost like they like plan for these things, and like it's almost like it's strategic when obviously it is, and obviously they do. Pragmatism, working with what we have. Does anyone know? Well, okay, we probably all know this. So between Trump part one and Biden, like from Trump to Biden, carbon emissions went up, deportations went up, police killings went up, and there's like no holds barred massive funding to this major ongoing genocide. I'm not going to say there's not a difference between the two parties. There are differences. There are plenty of differences, but those differences are not enough to save our lives. Those differences are not enough for survival. Those differences are not enough for basic dignity. And the differences only run so deep because they're a part of the same system, and that constant ability to go back and forth between one party and another is one of the main reasons that democracy is actually more resilient than fascism or other forms of dictatorship. It's one of the reasons why many capitalists the world over, and why many settlers in settler states, why many people who built their wealth through enslavement, why many of those, I'm not going to call them people, they're technically human beings, why many of those power holders actually prefer democracy over dictatorship, because it gives those extra mechanisms for stability. Ghouls, all right. So green energy, really briefly, with the Inflation Reduction Act that Biden passed over 2 years ago now, huge increase in investment in green energy, right? What happened with the carbon emissions in that same period? They kept going up. They claim in the US that US carbon emissions went down, but just not enough. That's not really true. It's a result of carbon accounting, because basically where the consumption happens, that's the country that gets billed for that, the carbon budget, as though on a planet you can borders make sense. There are borders in the atmosphere, there's borders in our survival, absolute bullshit. So with a glut of new oil and gas production, the US is claiming reducing carbon emissions by 1%, which is insulting and not enough, but also it's just not true, because globally carbon emissions and green energy investment were going up hand in hand. Why is that predictable? Why did those of us who were paying attention already know more green energy investment will cause more greenhouse gas emissions? Still operating within a closed system and capitalism. Both these answers are right. Let's. Do you mind if I pick on you since I know you? Can I name you? Okay, so Ian here is a big bad capitalist, old school kind of capitalist, not like a good, going to save us all Elon Musk kind of capitalist. So Ian pulled himself up by his bootstraps. Only got free ride at Harvard, and only started off with $10 million, very modest beginnings, but built it up into a great oil and gas empire. You've sunk a modest $1 billion into pipelines, all right, gas pipelines. Now all of a sudden, any other friends or strangers in the audience want to volunteer? Okay, you're like Elon Musk. You're big in the green energy, the green vehicles, and you get a bunch of government grants. And you start producing a whole lot of let's say wind energy, huge massive wind farms. You can get the land cheap, somewhere else, some empty terra nullius, some abandoned, uninhabited bit of land, say in Nevada or Arizona, places where I'm pretty sure they just discovered empty, right? And buy the land cheap and get a huge amount of wind turbines going. There's more electricity production because you got all your natural gas flowing into these generators that are burning the gas to make electricity. You got all your wind turbines producing electricity. So more total electricity. What happens to the price of electricity? It goes down. It gets cheaper. So there's more source. There's more supply. Sorry, more energy out there. So it gets cheaper. So that's just a good thing. We all save money, and then things stay like that, right? No.
Not quite.
The people who can make money off of producing things produce more of it. They sell more. What happens to poor Ian and his now threatened gasworks, right? So we have liquid capital and we have fixed capital. They exist on a continuum, but liquid capital, it's in a bank account, it's in stocks, it's in land, which is disgusting, but things that are really easy to flip. How easy is it to flip let's say 500-mile line gas pipeline and a power station which is designed to burn natural gas to generate electricity? How easy is it to turn that form of capital, that form of financial wealth, into another form of money? It's pretty immutable. You can't really, it's if it's not going to be used to burn gas, it's a lost investment. How does Ian's a human being, How does Ian feel about, losing like a mere $1 billion?
Nothing.
Probably has no feelings. Correct. What is Ian's world brain, the gears? What are they suggesting at the moment? Profit margins are going down. How do you make up for that? You produce more. If you're only making 10 cents on the dollar, and when before you were making 20 cents on the dollar, produce twice as much, you're bringing in the same profit. Okay, and that is like basic economics. That's what should have been predictable. That's what some marginalized and excluded voices, or people who are getting sent to prison as eco-terrorists, have been saying for a long time now. And yet the media is either spreading the lie that well, emissions did go down, but not as much as we were expecting, or they won't even mention it, or they'll express surprise about that. Because these are folks, they have think tanks, they have so many university-trained people at their disposal to produce whatever figures for them. I'm just suggesting that it's not a coincidence that this is either unknown or it's presented as a surprise when it is basically the only possible result from all of that.
Well, their rate of profit is going down, but our prices are going up.
Yeah.
My electric bill still goes up and everything still goes up, but their rate of profit goes down because the money's not worth what it's
Well, yeah, there's other things that come into it, like inflation and all that, and there's the question of do they pass on cheaper energy bills to us or not? Is there actually more unused supply? And if the prices for the big buyers go down, then they're building more, so then there actually is still an energy crunch, and so the consumer, the individual households are the last ones to get any lower cost benefit if there is one, and so often by the time it gets to us, we don't get that. But yeah, so it is more complicated, but what is happening is predictable. So that's as far as environmentalism, or urban gardening. If people don't specifically talk about white supremacy, an urban garden is a weapon of gentrification. And at the same time, we really need to start thinking about ways to feed ourselves, because industrial agriculture has already failed. One of the problems with apocalypse movies is it's always shown as a sudden thing. And there are definitely sudden moments, sudden changes, but it's also a very, very slow thing. So industrial agriculture definitively failed 10 to 20 years ago. Yeah, we're just slowly finding out, because we don't really want it's bad news. We don't really want to hear it. But yeah, it's based on petroleum. It's based on all these failed systems. It's based on destroying the soil. So community gardens, gardens in urban settings, very, very important. Very easy to justify, very easy to market as a wonderful thing. But if you don't specifically cultivate an awareness of and strategize for things like capitalism, if you silo this, if you let this become a single issue, then your wonderful project has just become a weapon for white supremacy, for gentrification, for rising rents, rising housing costs, etc. Abolition. Dean was this writer and organizer, Dean Spade, was invited to speak at a huge conference about abolition, and at that conference there were a lot of these really highly paid people who I would say are not just complicit but are conniving, who know if I say these things, I will make the big bucks. A lot of them were saying. It was kind of this slow process of let's do what we can to support these community programs, support people who are getting released from prison, protest against the cops, push for different sentencing guidelines, and then more and more, well, it's convenient to work with the state, it's convenient to work with the state, it's convenient to work with the state. And now the discourse, just 4 years after George Floyd, the discourse is the state is the best positioned vehicle for delivering abolition. Yeah, Ruth. Wilson Gill. Yeah. This is really, it's difficult to talk about, especially where survival is concerned, because it makes perfect sense when your survival is on the line to look for an immediate option for enabling or increasing your chances of survival. It also, I think, should make perfect sense that if the immediate options make things harder in the long term, we need to also do additional strategizing, spread additional critiques, look at other ways of moving forward. And abolition, like that name is a reference to an event in the past. Like this is not the first time. Like abolition has already happened. Basically, is what I'm trying to say. Just like decolonization already happened. And when something already happened and people are fighting for it again with very good reason, it makes sense to look at how it went down the first time. So like the announcement about the first abolition, like basically like Juneteenth, the reason that date is important, the speech that was given in Galveston, Texas that day, sadly, who gave it? A general, a military general, a white military general who announced, like, slavery has ended, and in that same speech already like very clearly pointed the way towards the evolving forms of both economic and racial oppression in this country. Like that speech came with threats of imprisonment or threats of like being shot if people congregate in too large groups, and that white general said like, go back to work at the old plantations, don't ask for government assistance, don't gather in large groups, or you might get shot. But you will get paid a paycheck from here on out. And that was a very complicated movement at the time. There were you had, your Quakers, you had your people who just cared about like, let's, make sure that the United States can survive, whatever we have to do to make that happen. And then you also had your Frederick Douglasses and John Browns and oh my gosh, Harry Tubman, thank you. Like you had, and they were also complicated people. They were like, we need to defeat this thing. Sometimes we'll ally with these people, sometimes we'll ally with these others, but like, it was a very multifaceted movement. And there were folks who were, who unfortunately didn't end up being like the dominant current, the current that was able to like create the vision of what abolition meant. And because it was the state, because it was an institution of the white supremacist system that delivered it the first time around, same with decolonization after World War II, the problem didn't go away, it changed masks, it changed forms. Or Sweden. Sweden for a long time has been like a good model, a huge model for like we can work with the state to phase out the prison system. In 2019, Sweden, which is a country of about 10 million people, had gotten their prison population down to like 4,000 people. Society of 10 million, 4,000 people in prison, and the prisoners had access to education, medical resources. They had like, lived in apartments rather than cells, etc. Where is it at now? As I don't know, there's no 2024 statistics yet. As of 2023, it had jumped up 50%. Why? Because states need weapons against their subjects. That is what a state is. A state unarmed cannot exist. And prison is a very useful weapon. It's a useful way to generate profit. It's a useful it's a useful way to terrorize people, to keep people down. And also, like, for folks in the United States to use Sweden as an example, like, there's a big difference between a settler state and, like, Europe, like, where white supremacy and capitalism came from, because that like the most deadly border in the world is the one that surrounds the European Union. So most of their violence is kept at arm's reach. It's kept in Africa. It's kept in West and South Asia. It's kept in South America. So they, like, Sweden voluntarily got to the place where they could have just phased out prison, and they're like, actually, we kind of like this prison thing. And that you will see it again and again and again, where we entrust the state to carry out radical transformations for us. What could help me trust hope again was like the next question I asked myself. What could help me trust hope again? So let the question linger. Is this whiskey? Is this water? It's water, sorry. It means I'm depressed. And thank you for whoever said no judgment. Sometimes we got to do what we got to do. I'm going to name a few things but not go into them because I am very bad at being succinct. courage. And often that means like the courage of like sharing an unpopular idea. It's not necessarily about, you know, being heroic, but sometimes like knowing your boundaries and being able to state them, or saying something that no one else is saying, can be the most important form of courage. Radical analysis, with like the original meaning, the root meaning of radical, which is roots, something that gets to the roots of a problem rather than just looking at the surface. Patience for complexity. Before I mentioned like simplistic analysis as like a red flag for me, things that like reduce everything down to like good guys and bad guys. There are moments when I definitely simplify, like people who are like rich, like actually, or yeah, humans who are like rich and powerful. I argue for not considering them people. I think they're humans. We shouldn't dehumanize them. They're human beings. But for me, a person is someone that you can have a relationship with, someone you can dialogue with, someone where there can be mutual influence. All right. So, and that includes for me like the ducks and the geese that I see in my morning walks on a little lake not far from where I live, who I can learn from, and you know, who maybe, I don't know, can they certainly respond to me. And I like millionaires and billionaires, like I don't see that, like, you know, state leaders, I don't see them like responding to the world as people. But anyways, that's you know, that's how I approach that. But the rest of us, we're all pretty fucking damaged, and we have like varying levels of access to resources. We have varying levels of privilege versus suppression. Some of these things you can see when you meet someone. Other things like you'll never be able to see and you may never know about. And also like how much power we have, how safe we are, how many resources we have access to, how much we might be like respected or listened to is going to change moment to moment, context to context. It's always shifting. So patience for complexity, memory, and care. So I promised I wouldn't go in depth into each of those. But I'm gonna finish by telling 3 stories, and then opening this up. Unfortunately, too chocolate, please. Yeah. I probably shouldn't have. This was not a strategic moment to eat the chocolate, but patience for complexity. There's a little bit of hope there. It's like I'm going to eat chocolate now because I very hope to like survive to a day in which we won't have access to chocolate here, because we shouldn't, because it's grown on stolen lands. It comes from very far away. Like yeah. So there's gonna be like a run on the supermarkets for chocolate after this. But like yeah. So here's to a day when like we grow our own food without you know, stealing from others, stealing from the soil, stealing from the forest, stealing from other people's. So this is hopefully a short story about the old woman in the middle row. So most of my adult life I've lived in other countries, primarily Catalonia in Spain. And there was just an event at a library. And so Spain, for those who don't know, is the place where you have like you had the longest lasting fascist dictatorship in world history. And the way it ended was not the way that you know, the Nazis or the Italian fascists ended in war. The capitalists in general decided that their interests would be better served through democracy than through fascism. So the fascists became the Conservative Party, technically the PP, Partido Popular, and then the socialists and the communists shook hands with the fascists, who had killed about 1 million people to take and hold on to power. The same socialists and fascists who, when the anarchists earlier in 1936 proposed making the resistance against fascism and against capitalism also an anti-colonial resistance, reached out to folks in northern Morocco where Spain had colonies and said, our fight is the same fight, let's fight together against capitalism in whatever form it takes. The socialists and the communists turned it down because the USSR was playing some kind of long game, which you're going to see how that turned out. And the socialists didn't want to upset their allies in France, since France was also a major colonizer in Africa, and you know, they were afraid of, you know, supporting an earlier wave of anti-colonial uprising. So that got nipped in the bud. And then once again, what do you know, patterns repeating, weird how that happens. The socialists and the communists decided to, the parties, capital C, capital S, shook hands with the fascists because they knew that when the elections came around, they would be the ones sitting in the seat of power. So Ricardo is an older friend of mine who was born under fascism and fought through that transition from dictatorship to democracy. He was actually in prison during the actual transition. He participated in an armed group. Several of his close friends and comrades were either shot down in action or executed. And he came out of this long anarchist tradition in the Spanish state, where earlier there had been sort of a partial revolution that anarchists, lowercase little c communists and other anti-capitalists had kind of pushed forward, without waiting for anyone's permission. And that was ultimately crushed honestly, by both sides, by the anti-fascist pro-capitalist side and by the fascist side. So he let me know he wanted to introduce me to this older woman who's sitting very quietly at this event in a middle row, but that he'd have to check in with her first. And later he explained that it couldn't happen because she didn't want to be introduced to anyone. She is someone who participated in she participated in the revolution in 1936, and she participated in the armed resistance throughout 3.5 decades of fascism. Her closest compañero and her best friend and partner was shot down in 1960, and she survived. She kept fighting, and she was just going through that whole experience of that many decades of clandestinity, and just in Catalonia, which is a quite small area, over 500 people were killed from a relatively at that point. 1 million people went into exile, and then many people came back and crossed the border. And in a small area, basically, of relatively small group, 500 people were shot down in action, or captured and executed, carrying out these different actions. And the movement today remembers a lot of that, but we get kind of the hagiographies, the stories of the heroes. And the heroes are often the ones who died. And dying is a lot easier than surviving. And just after losing so many people and surviving through so much of it, she very understandably had no trust whatsoever for the democratic regime because it's the same people in power, a broader group, but a lot of the same people. So she didn't want to be introduced to new people because she wanted to be still in her, I guess at that point, I think her 80s, wanted to be ready still to go back underground at any moment if the capitalists, might decide, as is their prerogative, to decide anytime they want, maybe let's do this murder and profit thing this way as opposed to this way. So I never got to meet her, but it was kind of anyways, her partner was actually kind of the most famous of the dead heroes. And I'm not trying to satirize that. They did an important thing and they gave their lives for it. But the fact that that there are folks who survive through that, but kind of only partially, and they can't share their stories, they can't share what they learned, and we don't even know them. We lose those relationships, and we become a lot poorer, we become a lot weaker, and the fact that we don't know how to help people fully survive, make it through that. So I think about her a lot. I remember very well what the back of her head looks like, because I was sitting in the back, of course, because I'm too cool for school. Fucking hate time. What the fuck is up with the Anglo-Saxon culture? A talk in an hour? No shade whatsoever to the organizers. I get it. I've been there, but an hour? That's for introductions. You need an hour. If you're counting, and who's counting? But how long it's been? A year and a half ago, I was getting off a train, and then like the next thing I know, I'm like on the ground surrounded by people. Anyways, had a seizure, got diagnosed with a brain tumor, one that's treatable but technically incurable. And since then, I've been getting a whole lot of support. Um, just like yeah, like an amount of support that they're like, like, oh, I don't deserve this, and like, people are like, people have been really great because that's, a whole lot of things come with like, like a that much like, brain surgery, radiation therapy, 7 months of chemo, etc. Um, and I just got so much support, and like it makes me feel weird because like cancer has been kind of like the easiest part of like these last few years, like having so it's like fortunately I'm kind of making friends with the tumor. It's like it's not moving fast at the moment. It's like kind of chilling now after the treatment. So it's I could get years or decades, and that's cool. Um, but like that's been like easy compared to uh, trying to get Medicaid and like getting Medicaid. Like that's fucking torture. Like just how intentionally humiliating and intentionally stressful it is. Um, or like also like I'll compare it to like sort of like movement heartbreak of like like in like the year and the 2 years before I got the diagnosis, and I was still living in Catalonia, and like I kind of arrived there. I was kind of forced to stay because I got arrested. Anyways, it's messy. While I was there, the movement went from like something that was kind of like weak and lost to something that was so strong that it could take over entire cities. It could send the police running. It could take over space in the city and transform it into an assembly. It could steal buildings from the capitalists and turn them into free social centers. It could organize mutual aid projects that were the main thing delivering survival supplies in like the first year of the pandemic. It was stopping evictions, um, and then it kind of like fell apart in a lot of ways, and like people just like were like doing like a shitty job like taking care of each other. The some of it is like expectations that change is going to be like linear, and it like never is. And if we like had any memory of history, we would know like there are going to be ups and downs. Some moments you got to be able to do these kind of things. Like these are the moments for like being able to like face off with like a big line of like really strong, really violent, really well trained cops and make them run away. Because if we can't seize space, we can't transform space. This is the moment for checking in on your friends. This is the moment for like making sure that like everyone has access to like some kind of like therapy and healing. This is the moment for like story time where we like talk to the older folks who've like lived through some other version of this, because like I can't remember, like history doesn't repeat but it rhymes. Like that is very true. Like it's never exactly the same, but we sure as fuck can learn things from like the earlier iterations of what we're going through right now, when like things kind of slack off, and like all of a sudden like no one would say that it's okay to burn down police stations because that's just irresponsible. It's because it's not happening. Once we show that like we can actually liberate parts of our city, we can make the cops afraid. We can get them for even like a brief period of time to like stay inside, to not patrol our neighborhoods, to not shoot people, like if they're afraid of us, if we can actually beat them in the streets. Like all of these different things are necessary, but when there's like when like we don't like get, like win the revolution in like 5 years or 10 years, um, and then people like they forget, or they're exhausted, they're traumatized, they haven't been taken care of, um, and then they turn to things that we've already tried before many times, that haven't been like defeated by the state, or like defeated by everyone in power. They're like self-defeating models, right? Like when people who like when large organizations that claim to be fighting against capitalism and colonialism decide to be like pragmatic about like decolonization and say like let's not make any anti-colonial alliances just yet because like that might upset our allies, or like let's try a referendum, let's try to like put a lot of effort into this election, and things will get better with that. um, one of the largest rent strikes in modern history happened in Gran Canaria, which is a part of the Spanish state, which is it's part of Africa. It's one of the remaining colonies slash settler state regions of the Spanish state. It's part of the Canary Islands off of northwest coast of Africa. Gran Canaria is the poorest part of the Spanish state. And in the first year and a half of the pandemic, roughly 30 to 40,000 people went on rent strike with the support, and like basically the rent strike was like, you know, organized, and you know the initiative was made by the Anarchist Federation of Gran Canaria, and they very willingly let the strike spread beyond their organization. They didn't want to control it. They wanted to help develop a tool and share it for other people to use. 30 to 40,000 people went on rent strike for a year and a half. No one had to pay back rent. No one got evicted. How many of y'all care about housing struggle? And are maybe worried about your own housing?
Yeah.
How many of y'all knew about that? Yeah.
No.
The reason, in this case, the reason, because like, me and other people were over there translating about a lot of stuff. You know, if you saw articles in English that were like, you know, maybe relevant to the Occupy movement, because it happened, you know, over there in Tunisia and then Egypt and then Spain first, or like about these general strikes and stuff, like things were getting translated from Spanish to English that were influencing movements here. The reason that you didn't hear about that is because of the movement itself. The housing movement in the Spanish state sabotaged the rent strike, because over the preceding years, when people were like, you know, oh, you know, we're not getting that adrenaline rush anymore of like, you know, these big riots, and like I'm getting exhausted, and you know, we're like falling into infighting, or like, you know, change isn't happening fast enough, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of people turned towards like a siloed single issue approach of like housing activism, where it was not as bad as like a charity, like giving people houses, but it was very much people who had the time to dedicate to like, if not full-time, near full-time organizing, spreading this model of fighting for housing, fighting against evictions at a sort of like low level of conflict, but not totally peaceful, like some level of conflict, but like most of all dependent on like these groups that were putting a whole lot of time into it. And that made a lot of sense in a certain moment, and that was very effective at like a level of like stopping like a few evictions a week in each city, which is great. That's amazing. That's important. But one thing is like, you know, resilience, like shifting, pivoting to a situation. And another thing are like, this isn't exactly connivance, but it's definitely ego. It's definitely like this sense of power that some of us get from like, you know, being the organizers, being the leaders. And they basically knew that like an actual rent strike, that they couldn't organize that. They couldn't stay on top of that. And so they would lose what power they had. They would lose their positions by helping turn the tool that they had made, which was a great, important, necessary tool, into an even better tool, into an even more powerful tool, and trusting people with it, trusting it to take on a life of its own. And they came up with all these bullshit reasons, which I'm taking too long in the story, but like, anyways, they sabotaged the rent strike. They saw that in the one place where it took off, it was a huge resounding success, and they didn't want to talk about it because it was embarrassing, because it would require self-reflection, it would require self-criticism. That's just one of like many, many things, and that I was also like, you know, suffering from like, you know, various forms of like, you know, poorly handled conflict and like, you know, lack of care in our movement spaces and everything like that. Yeah, I was just like, it was an incredibly depressing couple years, and I was like much more like just like feeling like how this movement, which like, you know, supposedly has this dream of like of liberation, of mutual aid, of like society where like what we do with life is like take care of one another, and like that's the most important thing. Like how we could like get to this point of like treating each other in these ways, or forgetting about each other in these ways. And like, yeah, that's why I say that like cancer has been easy, because it's like, it's a thing that people recognize, like, oh, a brain tumor, that sounds pretty bad. Like, you know, like let's support, you know, that person who's got a brain tumor. Like I don't want to like talk shit on that, because I'm extremely grateful, but it's like the closest that I've come to dying in like the last few years was like those like rough years of like seeing like how like we'd like betray our own dreams, betray our own comrades, like let people just like disappear and die. And like that was like so much worse. And like maybe, I don't know, like it's like I guess like I'm not, this is gonna sound like super like, you know, macho and like, whatever. So like bear with me. Like I'm not particularly like afraid of dying. I'm afraid of like plenty of things. I'm afraid of like coming to like a conference where there's like a whole bunch of people if I'm not like, you know, like the right place in my star charts or whatever, like too much anxiety. I'm afraid of a whole lot of things. Afraid of this fucking phone. But maybe it's because like in like, yeah, when I was 17, I like killed myself, got revived, whatever. So it's like, you know, dying, I've done that, been there. It's fine, it's okay. But like, when like, you know, the people that like you share this dream with, it's like really like based in like love and like the most expansive form of love possible. Like when we collectively like turn our backs on that, like that's like kind of like the hardest thing. That's like the most depressing thing. And that's like what really like drains away at hope. And we're in that kind of moment, right? Because like you know, in particularly in North America, we could say like, you know, 2006 with the uprising in Oaxaca, 2009 the uprising in Oakland after the police murder of Oscar Grant, 2014 Ferguson, 2020, oh geez, 2017 the airport shutdowns when we like shut down every fucking airport in the country because like you want to deport people, like fuck you, like we're not going to threaten a vote. We don't have people like in government who are like who have like the capability, the intelligence, or like the spine to stop this. We can do it by physically shutting them all down. Like, let's remember that, like, please. Like, but also let's remember, like, the kinds of times that we're in right now, these have happened before. And they suck. They're hard. We will lose some of us. We will lose ourselves sometimes, whether it's to suicide, to health problems, to addiction, to repression, to just the death of relationships, of solidarity. But we've also gotten through it other times. We could do a better job. It would be nice to not always have to start from scratch. The last story that I want to share, and I'll shut up. A while ago, there was a network of Mapuche comrades who were reaching out specifically to anarchists in other parts of the world, in like North America and Europe in particular. So the Mapuche their lands are colonized by Chile and Argentina. The U.S. and Canada are not the only settler states in this hemisphere. So their lands are colonized by Chile and Argentina. And they, so Chile, of course, to name one example, had a long military dictatorship. There were very strong anti-capitalist, left-wing armed movements fighting against that dictatorship. And the folks that I was speaking with, the Peña who I was speaking with, they came from that tradition. They participated in those armed struggles against the Pinochet dictatorship. And their experiences, they shared it with me, was that they felt like they were basically being used as cannon fodder by these like, you know, big Marxist groups, sort of like, you know, classically made like, you know, armed groups or proto-political parties. And they were basically like, you know, we're kind of done being cannon fodder, and we've looked around and we trust the solidarity of the anarchists better because they're not trying to convert us into anarchists. They're not trying to get us to be like followers in their organization, much less cannon fodder. It's like solidarity based out of like, they trust us to make our own struggle and they want to support it. And that's what real solidarity should be. They're also very clear, like, you know, we're not anarchists. Like historically, like we've been stateless, but we're not anarchists and we're not going to be. We have our own traditions around that. So anyways, what they were asking for was basically a few people from a few different countries to come, get to know some of their projects, get to know some of their communities in resistance. Where we went was around the Lake Yehu, which is occupied by the Chileans, partially occupied by the Chilean state because they can definitely not get away with everything that they want to do there, thanks to Mapuche resistance. They wanted to invite some comrades from other countries to create networks of solidarity and to create more possibilities of like, you know, us learning from them and, you know, us being able to mobilize support for their struggles. And I learned, I had the chance to go and I learned a lot. when I was there, and like a couple things that that were shared. So first of all, like one thing I love, the Mapuche, the word in Mapudungun for white people generally, whether it's like Europeans or white Chileans, and certainly gringos, certainly white North Americans, is Winca, which means new Inca, and that's really interesting, especially if we like get down to like the how like instead of like having like a simplistic analysis, like looking at the complexity of things by historical coincidence. So there were also like oppressive states formed in many other parts of the world that were based on some form of slavery, exploitation, warfare, etc. None of them nearly as brutal as like the modern state and capitalism formed as Europe, but still not great. And so the Incan Empire tried to conquer the Mapuche, as they'd conquered many other societies. And the Mapuche actually defeated the Inca Empire in a defensive war. And by coincidence, just a couple decades later, the first Spanish invaders appeared off the coast. And these were like these invaders were newcomers, and so of course the Mapuche didn't have a name or a word for them. So as soon as they saw how the Spanish invaders were behaving, they were like, oh, they're the new Inca, which showed that identification of colonization and the state. It really contains so much memory in a single word of intergenerational struggle, and it's fucking awesome because it's like we kicked the ass of the Inca. We're gonna beat these guys too, and they did. The Spanish actually never conquered Wallmapu. It was the modern Chilean and Argentinian states with the aid of the U.S. and the British. So a little bit of a stacked fight there. But a couple of things that were shared for me was that like one of the ways that one of the friends I made there put it was, we've been fighting for 500 years and we'll have to fight for another 500 years, but we'll win. And if I think about getting hope back, it looks a lot like that. Because it's a way of relating with the world that that abolishes the individual, which is a very silly fiction. Like in like a Western colonial context, to say we have been fighting for 500 years doesn't make sense, because like one human being doesn't live for 500 years, but also like we are not single isolated individuals. We are only here because we are a part of this intergenerational community, even though nowadays it's not allowed to exist as a community. And so that perspective, like we've been fighting for 500 years and we'll have to fight for 500 more, but we'll win. Knowing that we're all going to die and that that's okay, because there are others who will carry us forward, just the way that we're carrying others forward in the worst things that those who came before us have left us, and the best things, the scars that we carry, and also the lessons, the knowledge, the relationships, and yeah, that ability to see like there is something outside of all of this. If we can't imagine it, we won't be able to create it. If we can't imagine anything outside of a capitalist, white supremacist society ruled by a state, we won't be able to create that thing. And remembering that most of human history has been stateless, has been without capitalism, has been communal, has been shared, has been based on solidarity and mutual aid, and sure, plenty of conflict that sometimes turned into warfare. But again, nothing ever as brutal as what warfare means now. If we remember that, that helps us to imagine it. Because actually in the brain, memory and imagination are very closely related processes. And yeah, like referring back one last time to like one of these things that's like hope stealing, because I don't want to end with like, pure motivation, because that's bullshit, because it's not, the minute like the magic of my words fades away, it's gonna be like, oh, well, never mind, actually the world still sucks. Well, in this like process of kind of like sniping at any more like, radical currents, or trying to silence any more radical currents, said like, if it were possible to like, make a revolution without capturing the state, it would have happened already, which is fucking tragic on so many levels. Like also because like that person's clearly their political ancestors were often the ones who murdered revolutions that tried to go a little bit farther. With their their Chekhovs and their secret police. And also that person where they were working, making $600,000, obscene fucking dollars a year, is in Appalachia, which is one of the sites of a revolution against like an early state, against like a sort of forming proto-state. And one of the reasons that when European invaders came to North America, it like in North America, like, everything like, north of where the Aztecs were, there was no state. Wasn't because like, they'd stumble upon some like a Garden of Eden where people are just like, oh, we don't know anything. We're innocent and naive and peaceful. And like, we have no history or memory. Like they had states come up and they overthrew them and they remembered and they incorporated those lessons in how they organized. And those folks are still alive and they're still here. And some of us in the room I know come from some of those societies that are still in resistance. Some of us are in dialogue with them. Hopefully all of us are in solidarity with them. But like we need to remember those things because like the apocalypse started at least 500 years ago, right? We got to stop being afraid of the apocalypse. Tens of millions of people are already dying every year because of the ecological crisis, because of these various genocidal wars and land theft and the ongoing failure of industrial agriculture, the ongoing failure of capitalism. The apocalypse is already here. It will have some very, very fast moments, like when a hurricane came through and wiped my cousin's town off the map with a flood. And fortunately, like she and her little kids and her partner, or like their house is like just up the hill. Sometimes there will be very, very fast moments where we need to react. We need to get out there, whether it's like a police killing or a so-called natural disaster. But most of the apocalypse is very, very slow moving. And it's been going on for, it depends on where you look. Where most of my like biological ancestors are from, who are certainly not the ancestors I value the most. I identify more with my ancestors in struggle, but where my biological ancestors are from, I would say the apocalypse has been going on there for about 1,000 years, and there are other parts of the world where it's been going on even longer. The apocalypse is something that we need to survive. And we've been doing that. Not doing a great job of that, but we've been doing that one way or another. And yeah, we need to learn how to do it better. And I think we can do that through care, through memory, through having patience with complexity, through looking at the roots of a problem and how all these problems are interconnected, and recognizing we're not going to be perfect. We're going to fuck up, but we got to take care of each other through all this. And maybe in the course of that, maybe that freaking, sorry for all the cussing I've been doing, that freaking rapscallion, that dastardly swindler Hope, maybe, just maybe, Hope might win back our trust and earn our trust. And that would be great to have like a real foundation for hope to be able to continue in this. But, can't rush things. So thank you all for listening.